to me a little bit about what happened there, your feelings about that. Did Apple handle it well? Did they not handle it well? What did the government think? Go.
So in that instance, the concern or the problem was that the San Bernardino shooter had an iPhone that had a passcode on it the FBI was unable to crack, and it had the setting turned on where after 10 passcode attempts, or 10 failed passcode attempts rather, the iPhone will delete the data on the device. And so the FBI was unable to access this iPhone because Apple is pretty good at their jobs and at keeping the phone secure. And so they tried to get a court order to force Apple to build some sort of backdoor into the system that they could then send to the phone through a software update that would allow them to access the personal data on that phone. And Apple refused. And so I would say that that was a positive step in terms of personal privacy.
Apple publicly refused.
They did publicly refuse. But I would say that Apple operates under a bit of a double standard when it comes to personal privacy, especially, for example, when it comes to their dealings in China. Because with the Chinese government, which would not allow Apple to operate in the country if they did not really sell their phones in the country, they'd probably allow them to manufacture
Yes,
once
they
they
definitely manufacture
there. But they wouldn't allow them to sell their phones in China if they didn't give substantial access to the Chinese government, and which they do. So they're concerned about it when it benefits their bottom line.
So we've talked a lot about kind of everybody and kind of a mass scale of all of this data stuff. So personally, have you guys stopped behaving or started behaving differently online based on your research? And everybody's free to answer that. And if so, how have you and why?
So I haven't really, as a result of this particular research, although I'm a bit of a news junkie, so I was always already kind of aware of the general issues of government surveillance. But no, overall I wouldn't say that it's changed my behavior substantially. Although I don't have any social media accounts, for example, so I mean I do have less personal information out there. That was more of a personal decision than fueled by concerns that Uncle Sam was listening to.
I'm kind of like Nathan. The only thing I use is Snapchat because, well, I don't really know. I guess Snapchat's just kind of the thing now. But no, personally, I don't think it's changed nothing for me.
I've always kind of like Brendan. I've always been sort of careful with what data I give corporations. So back when I had a Facebook, I created an email on Google under a fake name with a phone number for the Pizza Hut in Nicholasville and gave Facebook that email for my account, which I set up under a misspelling of my name and just put my correct name in the profile. So, like, and that's because I just had too much free time when I was setting up that Facebook account.
I would agree with that, Nathan.
But, you know, it's one of the reasons that I don't have social media except like Thomas with Snapchat, because with Snapchat, the data that I feel I'm giving them isn't very significant because I'm not really sharing my life with Snapchat. There's not text involved in most cases. So I understand completely that they have all the data that I put on there, and it could be done with whatever they want to do with it. But in general, I feel more safe with that than anything else.
So what would you guys recommend as best practices to your fellow classmates, people of your generation, how to better protect themselves from data skimming, I guess information gathering online?
Well, I would say that where possible, you should use systems that do prioritize your data.
I was really hoping you were going to say the Pizza Hut phone number. But okay.
Well, I mean that too. Or you know what? You can go Papa John's, you can go to Domino's. But where possible, I'd say you should use systems that do prioritize your data privacy. So in a lot of cases, that'll mean picking, perhaps a subscription option over the advertising-based model. And I would also say that, when you download an app and it asks to access your location data, for example, don't say yes unless you are genuinely willing to give whatever corporation access to your location data. And, you know, as we've gone over several times during this panel, you know, these corporations do not necessarily have your interest at heart. They probably don't. And one particularly frightful example would be TikTok, which I'm assuming at least some people in the room use. Which I personally don't really understand. But in addition to being a company that gathers your information, they're owned by corporations that have very close ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And so that information is probably also being accessed by the Chinese government directly. They don't even have to hack into the servers this time. They just have
They
it.
own the server.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So, yeah.
I think you should be, would you recommend being a little more cynical about the data that is being gathered and has to be used? Like,
Yeah.
for instance, if Facebook, I don't know, we'll say theoretically starts up a string about post a picture of you from 10 years ago and picture of you from today.
yeah.
Should we maybe assume that that's not just so that everybody can see how your hair has changed and when you got your braces off and those things, but maybe they're using that to fine tune their facial recognition software?
Well, and additionally, if you think about it,
Just think about that for a minute, guys.
what do you think that Apple does with the Face ID recognition on their phones?
So they really want you to be able to get into your phone easier?
Right, and their fingerprint recognition to get into your phones. Like, there's just no way they don't store that information, so that's why I don't use Face ID or fingerprint recognition on my phone. So it's
It reminds me of the
simple things like
DNA
that.
test that people are doing now
Yeah.
also.
Genealogy
where,
testing.
Yeah.
Well, that's
and-
something I'd love to talk about if we can.
Yeah, I was
because-
about ready to ask about
Yeah,
that because we
there's
see.
there's one example here it's legitimately, it's the perfect example of what's happening with this corporate data collection.
Mhm.
So this man named Michael Ursary, he was approached by a couple of cops at his front door, said that they were looking into a hit and run that occurred a few blocks down, and they wanted to take him down to the station to see if he could figure some stuff out for it, which anyone who knows anything should have said, we ain't doing that, but he said, sure, I don't have anything to hide, which we could, if we had more time, we could talk about how that's a dangerous statement to make. So basically what they did was as they were taking him to the station, they had him in the car, and already my red flags are going off because I would say that's pretty close to a custodial interrogation in which Miranda wasn't read, but that's a different story. So they start asking him all these questions about a trip he'd taken in 2010 because they saw it on his Facebook. So they knew that he was in Rexburg, Idaho, where there was a serial killer who had operated back in the early 90s. It's 1996 murder of an Idaho Falls teenager. So what had happened was these federal agents had put the killer's DNA that they had collected from the crime scene and made an Ancestry DNA profile, as if I was swabbing my cheek and send it in to let them match me with relatives. They did the same thing with the DNA they collected in 1996. And what it did was it matched to this kid's uncle. And it was a false match. There was no familial relation whatsoever, but he spent a month being harassed by FBI agents until eventually he voluntarily, which once again wouldn't have done that, provided a DNA sample and proved it was not at all a match to the DNA that they had submitted to Ancestry. And the same thing happened, I'm sure y'all remember, when they caught the Golden State Killer. The police officers didn't subpoena Ancestry DNA, they didn't get a court order, they made a profile as if they were just wanting to look for the relatives, matched up to the guy's 7th cousin. And they were able to create a family tree, narrow it down to who was living in the area, who was old enough, got a search warrant, went through his trash, swabbed a Coke bottle, compared the DNA to the original sample, got an arrest warrant, he was indicted, and convicted. So, I mean, that's the problem, is that the data that's available, it just wasn't there. 20 years ago, they didn't have your DNA because you didn't give it to a corporation 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and this relates back to our previous conversation about especially big tech companies, because 23andMe, which is one of the most popular DNA testing services, is actually owned by Google. Well, more specifically, it's owned by Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, but they're in the same little corporate family.
So you recommend against using 23andMe?
As a
would
matter of
never.
personal privacy, I recommend against using
Because
any
my
DNA service.
my nutritionist wants me to do it
Oh.
so that I can improve like my overall health and wellness. So is that like what? Yeah. What,
So I mean, it depends. I mean, it depends on whether or not in this situation your medical concerns outweigh your privacy concerns. And I'm not going to tell you not to follow the advice of your doctor. That's
I'm
that's
just
hardly my
curious.
place.
Just
I
curiosity.
mean, I told my mother not to follow the advice of her doctor. Her nutritionist said the same thing. And we all just like sat her down in the kitchen and
Give an intervention.
had an intervention about giving these corporations their data, because the way that Ancestry DNA got this poor guy's uncle's DNA was because he had given an ancestry test to his Mormon church in Mississippi, who then sold their data to Ancestry DNA. So it was 4 or 5 times removed from this guy's original, this poor guy in Idaho, and yet it still caused him all those problems.
Yeah, and I would say that one potential solution to at least the medical side of this, where say your nutritionist tells you that you should get a DNA test, would be that there should be a mechanism through which, if it is recommended by a doctor, you're not just doing it to figure out who your cousin is, that you could do this and have it be covered and confidential as any other medical record would be. Because if you went and got, a blood test done at the hospital, they wouldn't be able to get that without a search warrant. And so I would say that that same standard should be applied in situations where DNA test is being used for medical purposes, even if it is going through 23andMe, but that's not currently the case.
So we've talked a lot about negatives, and how this is like a terrible thing, and my phone's sitting here and I'm scared, but have you, are there any positives to there being some form of structured, I'll say, surveillance in terms of the government kind of watching or listening or whatever they're doing?
Well, there certainly are. According to the NSA's data, so I mean, again, this is them talking about the reason for their very existence.
Sure.
But they do say that they've arrested or otherwise been able to apprehend, I believe it's a bit over 300 terrorist suspects post 9/11 as a result of various surveillance regimes. They haven't, in the research that I've seen, they haven't gone into particular detail about that and whether or not any of those would have been able to occur without the surveillance,
Gotcha.
or was it just a nice thing to have? But there is that.
I want to circle back to the I-360 and the information, and if you could comment on why that would be so important, because when you're talking about government surveillance and people who are shaping the laws that, for example, they might be voting on policy that impacts what people can and can't do or what corporations can and cannot do. Why do you think it's so important during the political process for people to have access to whether or not you like your guns, or you drink a lot of wine, or your behaviors from a marketing perspective? Why do you think that's important?
Well, if you went back, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, political advertising wouldn't have been able to target individuals as effectively as it does now. And part of that was because your advertising techniques that were available were pretty much radio, TV, and mailers, which you can't necessarily target to a person so much as you have to target to a geographic area. But now, with especially online advertising, I could show an ad to each one of you on the panel that none of the rest of you can see. And so I could show Mr. Robinson the ad about how, candidate A is going to be great for decreasing the price of servers for private schools, while I would show Mrs. Crosby the ad about how he's going to be great for, making making the life of the lawyers easier. So because you can personalize it more, they want more data to be able to do that